I was 40 minutes from home when my phone told me someone was inside my cabin. Not near it, inside it. 3 motion alerts, interior zones, 2:14 p.m. I pulled over and opened the security app with the particular calm that comes when you've spent 20 years as an electrical engineer and you built the monitoring system yourself, and you know exactly what you're looking at. There were 3 people in my off-grid cabin, on private land that had never been part of any HOA, on property I'd owned legally and outright since 2019. One of them was Sandra Whitfield, president of the adjacent community's homeowners association, who had been trying to get access to my land, one way or another, for the better part of a decade. She was measuring the walls. Her officers were photographing my licensed radio equipment and writing things down on a clipboard. They were inside for 41 minutes. They left a compliance notice on the door and walked away believing they'd gotten away with something. What they'd actually done was record themselves committing criminal trespass on a surveillance system I built myself and had been running for 3 years. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below, because what came next was one of the most satisfying legal countermoves I've ever had the privilege of setting in motion. My name is Garrett Malone. I'm 52 years old. I spent 20 years as an electrical engineer before I retired early, and before that I did a tour in the Army, where I learned, among other things, that the most dangerous thing in any conflict isn't the loudest person in the room. It's the quiet one taking notes. I live in the foothills of western Montana, about 12 miles outside Billings. I own 14 acres that I bought in 2019, land that borders the Pine Ridge Estates HOA community, but has never, in any legal or recorded sense, been part of it. The HOA was formed in 2015 to govern the 76-lot subdivision that was built on the adjacent parcel. My land is mine. Separate deed, separate tax parcel, separate everything. On the back corner of my property, I built a cabin. I did most of it myself over 2 summers, with some help from my buddy Clive, who used to do rough framing before his knees gave out. The cabin is about 900 square feet. It runs on a solar array and a lithium battery bank I designed and wired myself. It has a composting toilet, a rainwater collection system, a propane stove, and, most importantly to me, a ham radio shack. I'm a licensed amateur radio operator, extra class, which is the highest license tier the FCC offers. I have antennas, transceivers, amplifiers, logging computers, and custom-built equipment in that shack that I've been building and refining for years. The total value is somewhere north of $40,000. The FCC license is posted on the wall. I built the cabin to be a place where I could disappear on weekends. No cell service, no internet beyond what the radio provides, no noise, just work, quiet, and radio. After my wife Diane passed in 2021, the cabin became even more important to me. It was the place where I could breathe. I installed the surveillance system about a year after I built it, after I noticed tire tracks near the cabin one winter and couldn't figure out where they came from. I'm an electrical engineer. Building a monitoring system wasn't hard. I put up 8 cameras covering every angle of the exterior, 2 interior cameras in the main room and the radio shack, audio pickups at the entry points, and motion-triggered floodlights. Everything runs on solar with battery backup. The system uploads encrypted footage to a cloud server I manage myself. Continuous, automatic, silent. I mention all of this because it matters to everything that comes next. Sandra Whitfield moved into Pine Ridge Estates in early 2022. She was the kind of woman who arrived somewhere and immediately started reorganizing it to suit herself. 58 years old, blonde, heavily jewelryed, the kind of person who wore blazers to neighborhood cookouts. She had been a real estate agent in Phoenix before she retired, and she carried herself like someone who was permanently negotiating a deal. She ran for HOA president within 4 months of moving in, using the campaign slogan, and I am not making this up, a neighborhood that looks like we care. She won with 11 votes out of 47 eligible households. Within 6 months, she had fired the landscaping company, rewritten 2 covenant sections, and started sending violation notices to residents about paint colors, patio furniture, and the angle of mailbox posts. Residents were used to the HOA being largely ceremonial. Sandra made it a project. I heard all of this secondhand, from my neighbor Walt Greer, who owns 15 acres on the other side of me, and whose driveway happens to run alongside the HOA community. Walt told me about Sandra the way you warned someone about a weather system coming in. I didn't take her seriously. I should have. She showed up on my radar one Tuesday in April. I was in town getting supplies when I pulled up to my cabin on the security app and noticed the motion alert that had fired 2 hours earlier. There were people inside my cabin. I pulled over in the parking lot of a hardware store on the edge of Billings and sat in my truck for a while. The footage was clear. Motion triggered at 2:14 p.m. One of the exterior cameras had captured 3 people approaching the cabin from the direction of the Pine Ridge Road. 2 of them I didn't recognize, and one I recognized immediately from a photo Walt had sent me a few weeks earlier. Sandra Whitfield. She was wearing a blazer. Of course she was. The 2 people with her were a heavy-set man in a polo shirt and khakis, and a woman in her 40s with a clipboard. They walked straight up to the front door. Sandra knocked twice. When no one answered, because I wasn't there, she didn't leave. She walked around to the east side of the cabin, tried the window, and when she found it wasn't latched at the bottom, she worked it open. The man in the polo helped her get it high enough to climb through. He went in first, then unlocked the door from the inside, and Sandra and the woman with the clipboard walked in like they owned the place. They were inside for 41 minutes. I sat in that hardware store parking lot and watched chunks of the interior footage on my phone. Sandra moved through the main room touching things, picking up a portable transceiver, setting it back down, opening a cabinet and looking inside. The woman with the clipboard was writing things down. The man in the polo was taking photos with his phone. Sandra at one point stopped near the work table, where I keep my antenna building equipment, and actually pulled a small tape measure from her blazer pocket and measured the width of the table. She said something to clipboard woman that my audio pickup caught clearly. This would convert beautifully. Clipboard woman nodded. Before they left, Sandra taped a piece of paper to the front door. The camera caught enough of it to read most of the text. Notice of Architectural Standards Inspection, Pine Ridge Estates HOA. Property found to be in potential violation of Covenant Section 7B, regarding accessory structures and aesthetic compatibility. Then they climbed back out through the window and walked back toward the road. I sat in my truck for another 5 minutes. The smell of pine resin was coming through the AC vents, the lumberyard next door, and I remember thinking that it was a strangely pleasant smell for what I was feeling. What I was feeling was the particular kind of cold focus that I've only experienced a handful of times in my life. The kind that comes when someone crosses a line so clearly and so completely that the emotional response doesn't need to be loud. I drove home slowly. I didn't call anyone that night. I poured myself a glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and pulled up the full footage archive on my laptop. I watched all 41 minutes, twice. Then, I opened a spreadsheet and started a log. Timestamp, action, location in frame, audio clip description. I was going to document every single thing that happened in that cabin, the way I would document a systems failure, methodically, completely, without rushing. The next morning, I drove out to the cabin to assess it physically. The window they'd used was scratched at the sill, forced. The door lock had a small gouge near the deadbolt, like someone had tried it before realizing the window was easier. Inside, the main room was mostly undisturbed, but in the radio shack, the position of 2 of my receivers had been shifted. My logbook, which I keep on a specific shelf in a specific way, had been moved and placed back unevenly. Someone had been through it. Whether they understood what they were looking at, the frequency logs, the equipment notes, the technical records, was another question, but they'd been through it. I photographed everything. I measured the windowsill damage. I noted the door gouge. I saved it all to the same cloud folder where the surveillance footage lived. Then I drove to the county recorder's office and requested a copy of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, the CC&Rs, along with any recorded amendments. I asked the clerk to pull everything on file. She came back with a thin folder and a thicker one. The thin one was the original 2015 CC&Rs, standard stuff. 47 lots, governance rules, aesthetic guidelines covering those 47 lots. I opened the thicker folder and found, near the back, something called Amendment 14A, Expansion of Architectural Standards Oversight to Adjacent and Neighboring Properties Within Aesthetic Influence Zone. I read it twice. Then I took a photo of every page, and then I drove home and called an attorney. The attorney's name was Philip Ostrander. He was 61 years old, had been practicing property and civil law in Montana for 30 years, and came recommended by Walt Greer, who had used him in a fence line dispute years before. Philip had the kind of quiet precision I respond to in people. He listened completely before he spoke, and when he spoke, he chose his words like a man who charged by the hour and meant every one of them. I sat in his office on a Thursday morning with my laptop, a printed copy of the footage log, and the photos I'd taken of the CC and Rs. I laid it all out. He watched about 8 minutes of the cabin footage, then closed the laptop and looked at me over his glasses. They committed criminal trespass, he said. In Montana, entering a private structure without consent or legal authority is a misdemeanor, potentially a felony depending on how the DA reads it. What about the inspection notice? I asked. They're claiming some authority under an amendment. He picked up my photo of Amendment 14A. He read it carefully. He set it down. This is interesting, he said, and not in a good way. For whom, I mean, for them. Philip explained what he'd found. Montana HOA law requires that any amendment to the CC and RS be approved by at least 2/3 of the voting membership. In Pine Ridge's case, that would be at least 31 of 47 households. Amendment 14A, he noted, had 3 signatures. 3. And even if it had been passed properly, it couldn't extend HOA jurisdiction to private land outside the recorded plat, because HOA covenants only bind property within the recorded subdivision. My land was never part of that plat. It never could be. Sandra's aesthetic influence zone was a legal fiction. So the amendment is void, I said. The amendment is void, Philip confirmed. And even if it weren't, breaking into your cabin to conduct an inspection would still be trespass. HOA officers don't have law enforcement authority. They can't compel entry. They can't force inspections on non-members. They have the power to send letters, and, if a homeowner doesn't comply, to levy fines or go to court. That's it. I nodded. I'd suspected most of this, but hearing it laid out clearly felt important. Philip said he'd send a formal response to the HOA, a letter making clear that Garrett Malone was not a member of Pine Ridge Estates HOA, had never been a member, that his property was outside their jurisdiction, and that the events of April 18th would be subject to further legal action if not addressed immediately. The letter went out the following Monday. Sandra's response arrived 8 days later. It was not an apology. It was a cease and desist letter drafted by a Billings attorney named Gerald Metz, who I later learned charged bargain basement rates and handled a lot of small civil work for local businesses and associations. The letter claimed, on behalf of the Pine Ridge Estates HOA and its officers, that the inspection had been conducted under the authority of Amendment 14A and had been both lawful and necessary. It demanded that I sign an Acknowledgement of Compliance review, essentially a document that would have retroactively validated the entry. It also demanded I provide the HOA with a schedule of future access for quarterly inspections. Quarterly inspections of my private cabin on private land that they'd broken into. I called Philip when I got it. Good, he said. Good, I said. Yes. They've now put their legal theory in writing. They're committed to it. That's very good for us. He explained, by doubling down through counsel, Sandra and the HOA had transformed a potentially defensible mistake into a deliberate legal position. They were now on record claiming they had authority they didn't have over property that wasn't theirs, using an amendment that had never been validly adopted. Every word of that cease and desist was now evidence. I asked Philip whether we should respond immediately. He said to wait. Let me do a records search first, he said. Property transactions, HOA meeting minutes, anything public. I want to understand this woman's history with your parcel. I didn't know what he expected to find. I figured maybe some prior dispute or boundary complaint. What he found was considerably more interesting than that. While Philip did his digging, Sandra, apparently emboldened by her attorney's letter, sent a follow-up notice to every resident in Pine Ridge Estates, informing them that the HOA had conducted a successful inspection of the adjacent Malone property, and that the results would be discussed at the next monthly board meeting. I have a copy of that notice too. It's part of the file now. I want to pause here and explain something that took me a while to understand, because once I understood it, everything about Sandra's behavior made a different kind of sense. Property tax records in Montana are public. County deed records are public. HOA formation documents and recorded amendments are public. Meeting minutes, if the HOA records them properly, are technically subject to member request. All of this information is just sitting in filing cabinets and databases at the county courthouse, available to anyone who asks. Philip spent about 3 hours with a paralegal pulling records. What they found was this. In 2017, 2 years before I bought my 14 acres, those acres were listed for sale by the estate of a rancher named Harold Osgood, who had died without heirs. The asking price was $210,000. There were 2 serious offers on the property. One came from a land trust based in Bozeman. One came from a woman named Sandra Ruth Whitfield, then residing in Phoenix, Arizona, offering $198,500. The land trust's offer was accepted. The land trust held the property for 2 years, then sold it to me in 2019 for $231,000. Sandra Whitfield, who lost a bid on my land in 2017, then purchased a lot inside Pine Ridge Estates in 2022, moved in, and within months began positioning herself to claim jurisdictional authority over the exact parcel she had failed to buy 5 years earlier. Philip called me with this on a Wednesday afternoon. I was on the back porch of my house watching a hawk work the tree line. "Are you sitting down?" he said. "I'm standing," I said. "You should sit down." I sat on the porch step. He told me what he'd found. I listened to all of it. When he finished, I stayed quiet for a moment. "She's been trying to get her hands on my land for almost a decade," I said. "It appears that way," Philip said. "The inspection wasn't about compliance. She was casing the property, measuring the cabin, photographing the interior layout. That's not an architectural standards review. That's due diligence on a potential acquisition." I thought about the audio clip. This would convert beautifully. She hadn't been looking at my amateur radio equipment. She'd been looking at the space. Philip said we now had a much more serious situation on our hands. The trespass, combined with the apparent motive, attempting to gather information to support a property acquisition scheme, opened the door to additional civil claims, invasion of privacy, intentional interference with property rights, potentially even civil theft if it could be shown they'd handled or transmitted proprietary information from my radio logbooks. He also flagged something I hadn't thought about. My amateur radio station operates on frequencies licensed by the FCC. My call sign, my equipment, my operating parameters, all federally registered. Federal law protects licensed radio stations from interference and from unauthorized access. The FCC has enforcement authority that goes considerably beyond anything a Montana HOA has. "Someone rifled through your logbooks," Philip said. "If your station's technical documentation was accessed and potentially copied, we may want to involve the FCC." I said I'd contact them. I called the FCC Enforcement Bureau the next day. I explained the situation: licensed station, forced entry by unauthorized individuals, evidence of logbook access. The agent I spoke to was professional and thorough. She said they would open an inquiry. Meanwhile, I had been spending my evenings doing something else. I had gone back through a year and a half of Pine Ridge Estates HOA newsletters. Walt had saved most of them, and I had pulled out every mention of property oversight, adjacent land standards, and aesthetic influence. Sandra had been planting seeds for this jurisdictional claim for 18 months. Newsletters mentioned it vaguely. Meeting summaries referenced it obliquely. She had been laying a paper trail designed to make the eventual move look like a natural evolution of established policy, rather than a naked land grab. It was, I had to admit, fairly sophisticated. If I hadn't had the surveillance footage, if I hadn't been the kind of person who keeps records and pulls documents, she might have gotten away with it. A less prepared property owner might have signed the compliance acknowledgement just to make it stop. And once they signed it, they'd have opened the door to everything that followed. But I had the footage, I had the documents, I had Philip, I had the FCC inquiry, I had 41 minutes of crystal clear video showing exactly what happened inside my cabin. I just needed to decide how to use all of it. And that's when I stopped reacting and started planning. Philip and I met in his office again on a Friday morning, about 3 weeks after the break-in. He had a folder spread across the table. I had my laptop. We talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, We had a picture that was cleaner and more damning than I had originally expected. Let me walk you through what we knew. Sandra Whitfield had tried to purchase my land in 2017. She failed. She moved into the adjacent community in 2022. Within 4 months, she became HOA president. Within 6 months, she had drafted and quietly pushed through Amendment 14A, a fake expansion of HOA jurisdiction written specifically to give her board legal cover to access and inspect private land adjacent to the subdivision. That amendment was never properly ratified. It had 3 signatures when it needed 31, and had never been filed with the county in the manner required for recorded amendments. It existed only in internal HOA documents, dressed up to look official. She had then used that fake amendment as justification to physically enter my property, force entry into my cabin, conduct what was functionally a real estate inspection disguised as a covenant review, and photograph and document the interior. The cease and desist letter, which doubled down on the fake authority, had been written by an attorney who almost certainly didn't know the amendment was fraudulently adopted. He was working from what Sandra told him. The notice she sent to the HOA community claiming a successful inspection was a fabrication designed to normalize what she'd done and insulate herself with the appearance of HOA consensus. Philip laid out the legal exposure in plain terms. Criminal trespass in Montana is a misdemeanor that can carry fines and jail time. If the DA read the evidence as showing intent to commit another offense, real estate fraud, theft of information, interference with a licensed federal radio station, it could be elevated. The civil exposure was significant. Trespass damages, invasion of privacy, intentional infliction of emotional distress, legal fees. And then there was the FCC angle, which operated entirely outside the civil and criminal courts. "What do you want to do?" Philip asked. I told him. I wanted Sandra Whitfield, Derek Polk, the man in the polo, and Brenda Cook, the woman with the clipboard, charged with criminal trespass by the county sheriff. I wanted the civil suit filed against all 3 of them and against the HOA as a body. I wanted the FCC inquiry to run its course. And I wanted all of it to happen in a public setting where the residents of Pine Ridge Estates could see the footage and understand what their president had actually been doing. Philip nodded slowly. "The public element is your call to make," he said. "Legally, we don't need it, but I understand why you want it. I want 47 families to know what she used their HOA to do," I said. He leaned back in his chair. "Then we need to build this carefully and quietly for a few more weeks. We don't file, we don't serve, we don't engage publicly until we're ready to do all of it at once." I said I understood. I drove home from that meeting and put on my headphones and got on the radio for a couple of hours. 20 meters, working stations across the Midwest, the particular satisfaction of a clean signal in a clear sky. The kind of focus that comes when you know exactly what you're building and you've already confirmed all the parts will fit. The planning was about to begin. What followed was 3 weeks of quiet, methodical work. No public statements, no confrontations, no angry letters, just preparation. The first thing Philip did was retain a digital forensics firm in Missoula to authenticate the cabin surveillance footage. Authentication matters in court. You need to show that footage hasn't been altered, that the timestamps are accurate, and that the chain of custody is documented. The firm ran the full archive through forensic verification protocols, issued a signed report, and produced court-ready copies of the relevant clips. This process, which cost me about $2,000, would later be worth considerably more than that. Quick knowledge note for anyone who owns security cameras. Raw footage alone often isn't enough in court. Having your footage professionally authenticated before you need it, before any dispute, makes it dramatically more credible when it matters. That $2,000 investment is what turned my video from a guy's home security clip into admissible evidence. The second thing I did was organize the neighbor coalition. Walt Greer I'd known for years, and he was immediately in. 2 other adjacent property owners, a retired teacher named Doris Tanner and a rancher named Mick Beaumont, had both received informal letters of courtesy from Sandra, suggesting their properties might be subject to future HOA aesthetic review. They were angry, and they wanted to do something. When I showed them what I had, they were ready to sign affidavits about Sandra's pattern of overreach and the fraudulent amendment. 4 property owners, 4 affidavits, 4 voices telling the same story about the same woman, using the same fake authority. The third thing was the FCC piece. I worked with a communications attorney in Denver, a specialist in amateur radio law, to prepare a formal complaint documenting the unauthorized access to my licensed station. Federal law prohibits the unauthorized operation or inspection of licensed radio equipment. Entering my shack and handling my transceivers without consent violated FCC regulations. The complaint included the authenticated footage clips showing Polk and Cook handling the equipment, the audio of their conversation, and a complete inventory of every piece of licensed equipment in the cabin. The FCC inquiry, once formally initiated, operates on its own timeline and is entirely outside the control of the HOA or their attorney. This is important. FCC violations are not negotiated away through a county civil court. They're handled by a federal agency with their own enforcement authority. Sandra had wandered into a jurisdiction she didn't even know existed. The fourth piece was the criminal complaint. Philip walked me through the process of filing a criminal trespass complaint with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. I provided the footage, the property survey showing the cabin's location outside HOA jurisdiction, the CC&Rs showing no membership or consent, and the authentication report. The detective assigned to the case, a quiet, efficient woman named Harlow, reviewed everything over about 10 days and confirmed that probable cause existed for charges against all 3 individuals. She said warrants would be prepared and served at an appropriate time. I asked if she could time the service for a specific date. Detective Harlow said that was unusual, but asked what I had in mind. I told her about the monthly Pine Ridge Estates HOA board meeting, which happened on the last Wednesday of each month, and which was open to all residents. Sandra would be there. Polk and Cook, who were both board officers, would be there. There would be 40-plus witnesses, including, if I made a quiet call to the Billings Gazette, a reporter covering local government news. Detective Harlow looked at me for a moment. "You want service at the meeting," she said. "I want the community to see what their president did," I said. She said she'd see what she could do. The Billings Gazette reporter I spoke with, a young woman named Cassidy Falk, who covered Yellowstone County and surrounding area, was professionally interested and personally fascinated. I gave her the broad strokes, confirmed the date of the meeting, and told her I'd provide documentation she could verify independently. She said she'd be there. Philip drafted the civil complaint during those 3 weeks. Trespass, invasion of privacy, tortious interference with property rights, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Named defendants, Sandra Whitfield, Derek Polk, Brenda Cook, and the Pine Ridge Estates HOA as an entity. The damages figure was still being calculated, but the legal theory was airtight. By the 3rd week of May, everything was in place. The sheriff's office had their warrants ready. The Gazette had their reporter on calendar. Philip had the civil filing prepared. The forensic report was signed and certified. I drove out to the cabin the evening before the meeting and sat in the radio shack for a while. The equipment hummed quietly. The solar battery bank was reading 94%. Outside, the Montana sky was doing something extraordinary with the light. Orange and amber, and a shade of violet I don't have a word for. I logged a few contacts. I ate a sandwich. I drove home. Somewhere in the 3-week window between my planning sessions and the board meeting, Sandra found out that I had footage. I don't know exactly how. My best guess is that Gerald Metz, her attorney, did some digging and discovered that my cabin had a surveillance system and that I'd retained Philip. Attorneys talk to each other, even adversarially. Metz would have advised Sandra that footage could be a serious problem. She responded the way controlling people always respond when they realize they're losing. She tried to rewrite history before anyone could see it. On a Thursday evening, about 10 days before the board meeting, Sandra called an emergency HOA board session. Just the officers, no community notice, and pushed through a resolution claiming that the April inspection had been conducted with the knowledge and tacit consent of the property owner, that it was consistent with the HOA's established oversight practices, and that the board unanimously affirms the validity of Amendment 14A. I know this because one of the 4 board officers present, a man named Carol Thu, who had been quietly unhappy with Sandra's tenure for months, took notes on his phone and sent them to Walt Greer, who sent them to me. The resolution was a desperate maneuver. Tacit consent is not a legal standard. You can't consent to a break-in by not being home. And a board resolution, passed by 5 people in a back room, can't retroactively validate a fraudulently adopted amendment. But Sandra didn't know that I knew what the law actually said. She thought paper could bury what she'd done. She also began reaching out to HOA residents who lived closest to my property line, asking if they'd be willing to provide written statements supporting the need for oversight of adjacent properties affecting neighborhood aesthetics. Walt told me she called him directly. He told her, with considerable politeness given the circumstances, that he would not be providing any such statement. He did not mention that he'd already signed an affidavit for Philip. The statement campaign went nowhere, but Sandra wasn't done. She also had someone, I believe it was Polk, based on the timestamps and the vehicle description from my road camera, drive slowly past my property 3 times over 2 days, apparently checking to see if I had put up any new signage or fencing that could be photographed and used as additional violation evidence. My road camera caught all 3 passes, new clips added to the archive. And then she made the move that truly baffled me. About a week before the board meeting, a man named Langford Teague called me. He introduced himself as a real estate developer working out of Bozeman, said he'd heard my property might be available, and asked if I'd considered selling. He was pleasant, conversational. He said he had a client very interested in rural acreage in this corridor. I said the property wasn't for sale. He said his client was prepared to be competitive. I said it wasn't for sale at any price, but I was curious. Could he tell me who the client was? He said he wasn't at liberty to say. I said, "Tell your client to look up the Yellowstone County deed records for the Harold Osgood parcel transfer, 2017. Should be informative." There was a pause on the line. "I'll pass that along," he said. He never called back. I told Philip about the call. He added it to the file. Circumstantial, but consistent with a pattern of trying to acquire my property through indirect means when direct means had failed. Through all of this, I said nothing publicly. I didn't respond to Sandra's board resolution. I didn't reply to the HOA newsletter that went out the week before the meeting, which described the upcoming agenda as including a community update on adjacent property standards. I didn't answer the 2 voicemails Sandra left on my landline asking me to contact the board to resolve this matter cooperatively. I let her talk. I let her plan. I let her walk toward what was coming without any warning. The quieter I stayed, the more aggressively she moved, which was exactly what I expected from someone who interpreted silence as weakness. In my experience, people who mistake preparation for passivity tend to be spectacularly surprised by the results. The last Wednesday of May was coming. I had a laptop, a projector connection, an authenticated 41-minute video, 4 neighboring affidavits, a civil filing, an FCC complaint, a county detective with warrants, and a Gazette reporter with a press credential. Sandra Whitfield had a board resolution passed in a back room, and a real estate contact who'd stopped returning her calls. The week of the meeting, Sandra escalated in a direction I had not anticipated. She filed a complaint with the Yellowstone County Planning Department, claiming that my amateur radio tower, a 40-foot freestanding antenna structure I had installed with a proper county permit in 2020, constituted a hazardous structure in violation of county setback requirements and posed a risk of collapse affecting adjacent residential properties. The complaint was thin. My tower had been inspected and permitted. The setback was correct. There was no engineering basis for a hazard claim, but she filed it, and the county was obligated to open an inquiry. What Sandra didn't understand, and this is the part that still makes me shake my head, is that amateur radio towers have a federal protection layer that most local authorities are careful not to disturb. Section 97.15 of the FCC regulations limits the ability of local authorities to regulate the placement of amateur radio antennas in towers. There's also PRB-1, a federal preemption policy from 1985 that instructs local governments to accommodate amateur radio operators and to treat their antenna structures with reasonable accommodation. Local zoning cannot flatly prohibit amateur radio antennas. Setback rules can apply, but only if they genuinely serve local interests and aren't used as a pretext to suppress radio operations. When the county planning department got Sandra's complaint, they ran it past their legal staff. The legal staff looked at the permit, the setback measurements, the FCC license on file, and Sandra's complaint. They called me within 3 days to let me know the complaint had been reviewed and found to be without merit, and that the file would be closed. Then they did something I hadn't asked them to do. They sent a letter to Sandra, with a copy to the HOA's address, noting that the filing of complaints intended to harass or suppress federally licensed activities was not an appropriate use of county administrative resources. I read that letter twice. The county planning department had essentially scolded Sandra Whitfield in writing for abusing their complaint process. Philip said, "Add it to the stack." Meanwhile, the FCC inquiry had been generating its own paperwork. The communications attorney in Denver had submitted the formal complaint with the authenticated footage clips. The FCC Enforcement Bureau had opened a case number and requested additional documentation, which we provided. The investigation was running parallel to everything else, quiet and federal, and entirely outside Sandra's ability to influence or stop. 2 days before the board meeting, Carol Thew, the board officer who had been forwarding me information, called me directly for the first time. He said he wanted me to know that he intended to resign from the board at the meeting, and that he would be filing a written objection to Amendment 14A, based on the procedural violations Philip had identified. He'd done his own research. He wanted it on the record. I told him I appreciated it. I told him the meeting was going to be eventful. He said, "I figured." Philip filed the civil complaint the morning of the meeting. That meant, by 9 a.m. on that Wednesday, the complaint was in the courthouse system, and Sandra Whitfield, Derek Polk, Brenda Cook, and the Pinridge Estates HOA were all formally named defendants in a civil suit. The filing was public record. Anyone who checked the court docket that day, including, say, a reporter who'd been given the case number, would find it. I called Cassidy Falk at the Gazette to confirm she was coming. She said she'd already pulled the civil filing and was bringing a photographer. At 5:30 p.m., I loaded my laptop into a bag, along with a printed copy of the forensic authentication report, 4 signed affidavits, the full property survey showing my land's location outside the HOA plat, and a USB drive with the cabin footage clips. I drove the 12 miles into the Pinridge Estates Community Center, a beige building near the subdivision's main entrance, with a gravel parking lot and a bulletin board out front advertising a lost cat and an upcoming garage sale. Walt Greer was already there. Doris Tanner and Mick Beaumont pulled in just behind me. There were about 45 residents inside when I walked in. Sandra was at the front of the room in her blazer, behind a folding table with a name placard, looking confident and organized. She looked at me when I walked in, and the confidence flickered for just a moment before she reset it. She didn't see Detective Harlow, who was standing in civilian clothes near the back door. She didn't see Cassidy Falk and the photographer near the side wall. She saw a quiet man with a laptop bag who sat down in the 3rd row and waited. Sandra opened the meeting the way she always opened meetings, according to Walt, cheerfully, efficiently, like a real estate agent starting a showing. Agenda review, minutes from last month. She thanked the landscaping committee. She moved to item 4, adjacent property standards, community update. She began to describe the April inspection of the Malone property in terms that bore almost no resemblance to what had actually happened. She called it a routine wellness review. She said the board had exercised its authority in the interest of neighborhood cohesion. She said she looked forward to working with Mr. Malone cooperatively on bringing the adjacent property into alignment with community standards. I sat quietly through all of this. Walt glanced at me. I gave him nothing. When she finished, she asked if there were community questions. I raised my hand. Sandra looked at me and smiled the smile of a woman who has decided she has already won. "Garrett, so glad you could join us." I stood up. "I'd like to share something with the community," I said, "if the board will allow me to connect to the projector for a few minutes." There was a projector screen at the front of the room. Sandra used it for her presentations. She hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, then said, "Of course," because saying no to a community member connecting to the projector in a public meeting would have looked exactly like what it was. I walked to the front, connected my laptop, and opened the folder. "On April 18th, I said, keeping my voice level, 3 individuals entered my off-grid cabin on my private property, without my consent and without legal authority. My property has never been part of this HOA, is not subject to your CC&RS, and my membership has never been solicited or established. I want to show you what actually happened that day." I played the first clip. Exterior camera. Sandra and the two officers approaching the cabin. Sandra knocking, no answer. Sandra going to the east window. The man, Polk, forcing it open and climbing through. The room went quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet where 45 people are holding their breath at the same moment. I played the interior clip. Sandra moving through the Radio Shack, measuring the work table. This would convert beautifully. Cook writing on the clipboard. Polk photographing equipment. I paused the video. "That is a licensed federal radio station," I said. "The equipment in that room is registered with the FCC. Entering it without consent is a violation of federal regulations, which is currently the subject of an FCC enforcement inquiry." I held up the authentication report. "This footage has been forensically authenticated and is now part of a civil filing that was made this morning with the Yellowstone County Courthouse, naming the HOA and the 3 officers you just saw as defendants." Sandra started to say something. I kept going. "I also want to address Amendment 14A, which was cited as the authority for this entry." I put the amendment on the screen alongside the CC and RS signature requirement. Montana HOA law requires a 2/3 supermajority for CC and R amendments. Amendment 14A has 3 signatures. It was never properly filed with the county. It has no legal effect. The attorney who sent a cease and desist on its behalf was working from information that was not accurate. I looked at Sandra directly. "And I want this community to know one more thing." I brought up the 2017 property records on screen. "These are the Yellowstone County deed records for the Harold Osgood parcel transfer, the land I currently own. You'll see 2 offers. The second one is from Sandra Ruth Whitfield, then of Phoenix, Arizona. She tried to buy my property in 2017. She lost the bid. She moved here in 2022, and the first thing she did as your HOA president was draft a fake amendment to give herself legal cover to inspect my land again, this time without paying for it. The room did not go quiet this time. The room erupted. Sandra was on her feet. Her voice was loud. I stepped back from the projector and sat down. Detective Harlow came through the side door. She identified herself, stated that she had warrants for criminal trespass charges, and asked Sandra Whitfield, Derek Polk, and Brenda Cook to step outside. Polk stood up immediately, looking like a man who had known this was coming and was relieved it had finally arrived. Cook started crying. Sandra argued for about 30 seconds before the detective said something quietly that made her stop. Cassidy Falk was typing on her phone. The photographer was working. Carol Thew stood up and announced his resignation from the board and his intention to file a formal procedural objection to Amendment 14A. 3 more board members resigned before the evening was over. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. At the end of it, the remaining HOA membership voted unanimously to void Amendment 14A and to direct the HOA's General Counsel to conduct a full review of any other amendments passed during Sandra's tenure. I drove home under a Montana sky full of stars and didn't say a word the entire way. The criminal trespass charges were resolved through a plea agreement about 4 months later. Sandra, Polk, and Cook each pleaded guilty to misdemeanor criminal trespass. Sandra received a suspended sentence with 18 months probation and a $2,000 fine. Polk and Cook received smaller fines and 6 months probation. The plea deal required all 3 to have no contact with my property. The civil suit settled 8 months after that. I won't disclose the exact terms, but the combined settlement from the HOA's insurance carrier and the 3 individuals came to just over $23,000 in damages and legal fees. Phillips' invoices were covered. I had money left over. The FCC concluded its inquiry and issued a citation against Sandra Whitfield personally for unauthorized interference with a licensed amateur radio station. The fine was modest by federal standards, a few $100s, but the citation is a matter of permanent federal record. The FCC doesn't erase those. Gerald Metz, the attorney who sent the cease and desist letter, apparently contacted Phillip with a fairly sheepish apology once the dust settled. He had not been told that the amendment was fraudulently adopted. He wasn't sanctioned professionally. He'd acted in good faith on what his client told him. But I imagine the experience gave him something to think about regarding how carefully he vets HOA clients going forward. The Pine Ridge Estates HOA conducted a full governance review. 2 additional amendments from Sandra's tenure were voided. The community hired a property management company to handle administrative functions and established a requirement that all future amendments be reviewed by an outside attorney before being voted on. They also held a proper election for new officers. Carol Thu became interim president. He called me once after the settlement. We had a short, pleasant conversation. He said the community was doing better. He said some of the residents had left notes in his mailbox, thanking him for speaking up at the meeting. He said he was sorry it had taken something like this to shake things loose. I told him I didn't blame the community. I blamed one woman who found an institution and decided it was a tool. As for the cabin, it's fine. Better than fine, actually. I upgraded the solar array that fall, added 2 more cameras, and put in a proper steel door to replace the one that had been damaged. The Radio Shack is exactly as it was, maybe a little more organized. I log contacts on the radio most weekends. The FCC license is still on the wall. I used $2,500 of the settlement to establish a fund through the local amateur radio club in Billings, the Yellowstone Amateur Radio Society, to provide no-cost licensing study materials and exam fees for young operators. We've had 11 new hams get their licenses through the program in the first year. 3 of them are teenagers. One of them built her own dipole antenna from scratch. I took a photo of her standing next to it, and it's pinned above my workbench in the cabin. There's a sign Walt made for me, hand-routed wood, the kind of thing he does in his workshop on slow afternoons, that's mounted near the cabin door now. It reads, "Private property, no entry, you are being recorded." It was there before, actually. The notice was always there. Sandra just didn't read it. So if you've got a cabin, a workshop, a piece of land, or any property that matters to you, document it, permit it, secure it. Know your jurisdiction, line the way you know your own address. Because the only thing standing between you and someone like Sandra Whitfield is the paper trail you built before she showed up. And if any of you have faced something like this, an HOA overreach, a neighbor who decided your property was theirs to manage, drop your story in the comments. I read every one of them. And if this one hit close to home, consider subscribing, because we've got more coming, and trust me, next week's story is going to make this one look like a minor paperwork dispute. Stay sharp. See you next time.
Here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this story. Sandra Whitfield didn't fail because she was unlucky. She failed because she assumed the man she was targeting and hadn't built anything stronger than she had. She built a fake amendment, a confident persona, and a plan that depended entirely on her target being unprepared, unrecorded, and unwilling to push back. Garrett had been building something for years: the cabin, the system, the documentation habit, the professional network. He didn't build any of it to fight Sandra. He built it because she was the kind of person who does things right and keep records of doing things right. That's the actual lesson here. The best defense against petty power is the quiet, unglamorous work you do before anyone tries to use it against you. Permits, documentation, broker procedure, and attorney numbers in your contact. And honestly, if you ever feel like someone in a position of fake authorities decided your property was theirs to manage, you want to hear about it? The comments on these channels are full of people who live versions of this story. You're not alone in it. If this one hit home, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because next week, we got a story about a man who discovered his HOA has been faking inspection reports for 6 years, and the one document he found that's brought the whole thing down. The one's going to keep you up at night in the best possible way. See you then.